Hearing is now resumed.
Good morning, Commissioner Cohen, Brian Wallace, Commission Counsel, and Lara Tesoro is with me. This morning we are reassembled from December the 16th when we were almost but not quite concluded the cross-examination of this panel composed of Mr. Sprout and Ms. Farlinger, the previous and current regional directors general for the Pacific region. There are 5 counsel who have advised me they have questions in cross-examination. Mr. Rosenblum is concluding his. He has estimated 20 minutes. Mr. Eidsvik has advised me that he will be about 30 minutes. Mr. Harvey has indicated 45 minutes. Mr. Lowe's says he'll be brief, 10 minutes or less, and Ms. Gertner has an estimate of between 45 minutes and 1 hour, all of which should allow us to complete this, I think, early this afternoon. Before we start, Mr. Timberg has one piece of documentary business that he'll explain arising from before Christmas.
Mr. Commissioner, Tim Timberg for Canada, and with me is my colleague Geneva Grande McNeil. Ms. Farlinger, last December 16th, you entered, we were discussing an ecological risk assessment guide to ecological risk analysis at Exhibit 276. If we could have that, Mr. Registrar. And at the time, you clarified that this was the American version of the ecological risk assessment, and we undertook to provide the Canadian version. And so this here, if we could have the Canadian version. Ms. Farlinger, can you identify this document, please?
Yes, this is the current DFO guidance for ecological risk assessment, and as you'll see, it's in draft.
Thank you. If that could be marked as the next exhibit, I understand we'll mark it as 276A.
That's correct. It'll be marked as 276A.
And then, Mr. Registrar, if we could have Exhibit 273 brought up, please. And Ms. Farlinger, last December 16th, we were discussing DFO's Sustainable Fisheries Framework and the Fisheries Checklist. So, Ms. Farlinger, we were discussing the Sustainable Fisheries Framework and DFO's Fisheries Checklist, and this was not the DFO Fisheries Checklist. And if we could then, Mr. Registrar, have the correct exhibit. And Ms. Farlinger, can you identify what this document is, please?
This is the most current version of the fishery checklist, which we use now in developing integrated fishery management plans.
And for the record, I noticed the year 2010, 2011. And if this could be marked, I understand, as Exhibit 273A.
That will be so marked. Thank you.
Those are all my questions.
Sorry, which number is that?
273A.
Don Rosenblum, as both witnesses will recall, I represent Area D Gillnet, Area B Sainer. You'll recall that last day I was cross-examining you, and the matter was put over, and I wish to complete my cross-examination this morning. Ms. Farlinger, I want to start with your will say, as filed as an exhibit. It is Exhibit 245. Mr. Lunn will put that document before us, and I will ask Mr. Lunn to turn to page 3. The pages are unnumbered, but I will want you to focus on a certain paragraph, and at page 3, down 4 bullets from the bottom, it starts, if asked whether DFO has implemented. Do you see where I'm reading?
Yes.
Yes. I want to read that paragraph out to you, and then I want to ask you a few questions in regards to that paragraph. You say there, if asked, excuse me just one second, I gave you the wrong paragraph. Yes, if asked whether the DFO has implemented the WSP as quickly as it could be implemented, she will say the WSP could be more quickly implemented if all stakeholders accept the need to implement it. She will say that one of the reasons that it is taking a lot of time to implement the WSP is that the stakeholders who originally embraced it are now encountering its realities. She says that as DFO implements the WSP, it has or will result in significant changes for harvesting, habitat management, and SEP. My question to you is, can you provide evidence to this commission how the stakeholders have obstructed the process?
I wouldn't say the stakeholders have obstructed the process. I think and it's a point I believe I've made several times along the way in talking about the wild salmon policy, is while information is important, while financing is important, it really is bringing together the stakeholders who are affected by the implementation of the wild salmon policy to agree on that information, and then ultimately to have the kind of discussions that consider alternatives that will have impacts on those stakeholders. And as we move from the situation where it is a policy level document when it was published in 2005, and we work through that science and we work through the other supporting information, and we begin to look at what implementation means, then the impacts become clearer to all of the stakeholders, and really it's across the spectrum. So I wouldn't say that the stakeholders are holding this up. I would say that stakeholders are now in a position, as we move closer and closer to implementation, of understanding what the implications may or may not mean to them.
Well, I may be the only one in this room that interprets that paragraph as placing some blame on the stakeholders for an implementation slower than you wanted or expected. You say in part there, she will say that one of the reasons it is taking a lot of time to implement the WSP is that the stakeholders who originally embraced it are now encountering its realities. Do you have any evidence to bring before this commission that the stakeholders have been holding you back in the implementation of the WSP?
I'd like to clarify that holding DFO back is not the issue here. The challenge is for all of us in implementing the wild salmon policy. As we gather more information, as we move closer to implementation, that all of us, including members of the public, fishing communities, be they recreational, commercial, Aboriginal, and other groups, understand better the implications. And it really is that strategy for discussion, which is the takes the information that's available and begins to talk about alternatives in terms of what would it mean to implement the wild salmon policy. If I were to say, for example, look at the Cultus Lake sockeye stock as an example, or the changes in harvest rate on the Skeena River, for example, those are challenging because they have impacts on harvesters. It is not a question of holding it up. It's simply a question of having to work through common understanding of the information and the impacts.
Yes.
And quite frankly, we're continuing to do that as we go along.
Well, I hear you, and forgive me for breaking in, but I have Mr. Wallace breathing down my neck about 20 minutes of cross-examination. You're speaking of the fact you need cooperation from the stakeholders, correct? Obviously.
It's pretty clear that the wild salmon policy contemplates a collaborative process, but DFO as the regulator is in a position to where we are required to move forward and make regulatory decisions.
Right.
Now, obviously, those are much harder if we haven't worked through the issues, have common understanding of information, and have processes where stakeholders actually talk to each other about the impacts and how those can be considered.
I
And
fully-
that takes time.
I fully understand, but you don't have evidence to bring forward that there's been a lack of cooperation until now, have you?
I don't think there's a lack of cooperation. I think there is a variety of views that need to be reconciled. And quite frankly, it takes time to reconcile those views and understand the impacts.
Let me move on to the second area of my cross-examination. In the transcript of the last
Could I
day-
ask something?
Sure.
The last thing we discussed before we left on December the 16th was habitat restoration. And as I walked away from that, I realized that I was somewhat weakened in my last response. So if I could take half a minute to simply clarify my response, I'd
If
happy
half
to
a
do
minute,
that.
yes. If it's a lot more than that, I'd rather it be done through your counsel in his re-examination. But half a minute, go ahead.
Okay, I'll do my best. You had asked me the question if the only way the department did habitat restoration was when charges were laid and fines had been administered, and those could be used for habitat restoration. And the simple answer to the question is no, that's not the case. We have a $5 million habitat restoration group in the Salmonid Enhancement Program, and we do a variety of things leveraging those funds most years in the ratio of 5 to 1, working with stakeholders and interest groups to do habitat restoration. So it's much broader than the question you asked. That's it.
Thank you. And after you gave that response last day, Mr. Sprout actually responded to the question, didn't he?
I guess he may
Okay,
have, yeah.
well, in any event, the record will speak for itself. He did. Now, coming to the second area of my cross-examination today, I want to refer you to the transcript of last day, and Mr. Lunn, if you could get out December 16th, and if you could get out page 91, where you're responding to me, and to speed this up, let's start at line 25, and I'll read that paragraph. Line 25, you say in part in response to a question of mine. Secondly, I would like to say in the list you saw this morning with respect to the implementation national policy, that checklist that was referred to, and then economic analysis as it pertains to each and every fishery now is required as part of that checklist, as part of the integrated management plan for each fishery. We do not have all of those done at all of the IFMPs for all of the fisheries, but they are underway on a priority basis. Can you fill us in to what extent they have been done up to this moment in time? Have any of them been completed?
Yes, some of them have been completed. I can't tell you exactly which ones, but we started a year and a half ago when the checklist first came into operational use to set priorities for our internal economists to begin to work through the economic analyses for the various fisheries. So yes, we do have some done.
What percentage of the CUs that you would expect to have socioeconomic work done, what percentage of those have had their studies done?
I can't tell you at this time, and I can't, in fact, tell you whether there is any economic analysis done on the salmon integrated fishery management plan. We have some 30-odd other integrated fishery management plans for the region. But I do know we have some completed, and I can certainly provide you with the information on which ones are completed and which ones are not.
Sorry, do I understand you to say maybe the ones that have been completed aren't even relating to sockeye salmon?
That may be the case.
So it may be that, in fact, no studies have been completed with sockeye salmon of the Fraser River in respect to the CUs.
There may have been economic studies. The specific economic analyses that we are talking about under the IFMP may not have been completed for Fraser sockeye.
On any of the CUs?
It may not.
Yes.
Yes.
And you will be kind enough to provide that information through your counsel, Mr. Timberg?
Yes.
And provide it to us in turn. Thank you
Certainly.
very much. I come to the third area of my examination today, day of your testimony, not on the 16th, but the previous date of that. I forget whether it was the 9th of December or whatever, that you spoke about the fact that the department would be consulting with the stakeholders throughout the process of implementation of the WSP, that you suggested there had been consultation in the past and there would continue to be. You recall generally that testimony?
In general, yes.
Yeah, in general. Tell me, how do you envisage that consultation to take place in the future? And I assume by stakeholders, you obviously include my clients, the harvesters, and obviously First Nations and so on and so forth. Very, very, very briefly, can you tell us how you imagine that consultation will be taking place? Will it be taking place through the consultative processes that we're familiar with, the bodies that have been spoken of time and again, or something else?
The consultation process, which has been taking place and continues to take place on wild salmon policy, happens through the existing fishery management consultation process, as well as through a variety of sporadic arranged meetings which occur on particular topics. So I could use as an example the fall dialogue discussions. There have been discussions and updates and on the wild salmon policy in that forum. There have been discussions in specific meetings arranged with First Nations. There have been updates, regular updates at the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee for salmon. So there's a variety of ways, including some other watershed and other processes. So I think the short answer is there's a variety of processes, but we certainly use the regular consultation process as well.
Are you in a position to indicate to the Commission that before management decisions are taken on a CU basis, that you would be consulting with the stakeholders?
The management of the fishery and the decision rules associated with that in any particular year are made through consultations in the integrated fishery management plan. So before an action is taken, there is consultation on those rules, and those rules represent the implications if it is for a stock of concern or a CU.
Yes. So your response is in the affirmative, that stakeholders would be consulted in respect to management decisions on a CU basis.
Management decisions as they affect the harvest of the fishery would be consulted on.
Thank you. And can one assume that that consultation generally would also be implemented to ensure that the Native Brotherhood of British Columbia and the First Nation Vessel Owners Association, in other words, the First Nation organizations that are in the commercial fishery, would also be consulted?
We consult a variety of groups, and some members of those two groups are on various either local advisory committees, harvest committees as we call them, or members, if they are elected by their harvest group, that is all the fishermen who harvest in that particular fishery, then they can be members. Discussions with those groups are not formally part of the process, but they are members from time to time who are elected to the process. Certainly they're members of the area-based harvest committees, and they may be elected by those members to go to the higher level process.
In your absence, after your last appearance here, we've had a lot of evidence about over-escapement issues, a panel that spoke about over-escapement and delayed density dependence and all these issues. My question to you is this, and again, maybe I'm the only one not understanding this. With the implementation of the WSP, are issues of over-escapement, delayed density dependence, cyclic dominance, all factored into the decision-making and implementation of the WSP?
When fishery management decisions are made or the science supporting those are in place, there are analyses from time to time that have gone through the science process, or external analyses such as the one done by the Pacific Fishery Resource Conservation Council on impacts of over-escapement that are factored into the decision-making. Many of the models used in doing forecasting for Fraser sockeye are heavily dependent on cyclic dominance parameters being integrated into those models.
So can one assume, if one is a advocate of the principle that over-escapement can have a detrimental effect on stock, can those individuals feel confident that with the implementation of the WSP, that one of the factors that a DFO will consider in stock assessment and stock health will be over-escapement?
Certainly one of many factors, but yes.
Yes. And so one can imagine hypothetically that where there is a threatened stock, DFO could come to the belief that there has been an over-escapement of that stock, and therefore they would reduce escapement in the future, hypothetically.
Hypothetically, I think like much of the science around Fraser sockeye and other salmon, there are a variety of views in the scientific community about that. And so once again, those views will be brought to the table, they will be discussed, they will be incorporated, and the uncertainty around them will need to be taken into account.
But you believe that the WSP, as currently before you as a policy, does afford the opportunity for your managers to render a decision that there has been an over-escapement and to take necessary action?
If in fact in that instance that the information, including science that we had, supported that, it would certainly be something that would be considered along with all the other factors around the forecasting and health and recovery and rebuilding or maintenance of that stock.
Of course, thank you. Two last areas of examination briefly. The first is, after your last appearance here, there has been evidence given by Dr. Riddell in respect to the budgetary restraints that you in region and national office are grappling with in light of Treasury Board decisions. And I want to refer you to testimony of Dr. Riddell and then ask for your comment. Firstly, Mr. Lund, transcript of February the 3rd. At page 28, I won't read out page 20, but I'll just summarize it. And if for any reason you want to go directly into transcript, but I'm trying to speed this up, but I'm happy to. Basically, he's speaking about the 5% reduction, and he was explaining to the Commission that that 5% reduction is really not a 5% reduction on operating expenses, on the total budget, but rather is focused on the operating expenses, which means that it truly is a reduction of 15 to 20%. I just want you to look at the top of page 29.
Sorry, I'm having a little trouble. I'll bring it up as soon
No
as I
problem. Again, February the 3rd. While Mr. Lund's bringing it up, let me just read it to you, and then if you wish to see it. It's line 3, and Dr. Riddell says, yes. Here we go. Page 29. There we go, line 3. Dr. Riddell said, yes, the conversation was one of, and this does not, depending on how the reduction is defined, but if you have a 5% on total budget, that will include salaries. Typically, you will also have restrictions on what you can take the reductions in, and it frequently does not include salary. But if you have the 5% off total budget, it can easily equate to a 15% of operating funds. And also, he testified on another date, and Mr. Lund, if you would bring this forward, February the 2nd, the previous day, I should have started with this, at page 50, Line 39, Dr. Riddell said down at the bottom of the page, could I just add, it's sometimes easy to forget exactly what 5% means, because the 5% expression now is 5% on total budgets. So it sounds a fairly small percent, but you also have government guidelines where you're not allowed to reduce staff unless they're term field staff working in projects on a very short-term basis. So what that means to a senior manager is 5% of your total budget. Very broad terms, at least 70% of your total budget is likely taken up in salary. Well, salary, wages, benefits, and all that. And so really, you're looking at 5% of the total that turns into more like 15 or 20% of operating at times. All right? And so these small cuts have a very almost insidious way of accumulating to significant reductions in programs. Okay. First of all, do you agree generally with what Dr. Riddell has testified to here?
I guess I would first say is I don't know what 5% he's referring to, but he seems to be saying in general that 5% can be taken away or can cause a reduction in a number of ways. Now, it is possible to reduce staff. It is possible to reduce operating funding. And so in general, those any reductions can be targeted in various ways.
Okay, let's take this step by step. Firstly, as to the 5% he's referring to, your deputy minister, Claire Dansereau, did testify here early on, one of the earliest days, that I believe she testified that the department was facing a 5% reduction.
Okay.
That's what I believe he's referring to. Now, my question simply is this,
Okay.
and I see Mr. Wallace wanting to cut me short, so I want to be quick on this. You do not accept, then, what Dr. Riddell has said to this commission, that a 5%, prospective 5% reduction really isn't 5%. It is between 15 and 20% of the operating budget of the department. You don't accept that?
The 5% you're talking about, which is all federal departments are required to go through in strategic review, can be implemented in a variety of ways, either through salary or operating. So that would be my answer to that question. And if that's the 5% that you're referring to, we will see that on a program basis. It is a process of looking at lowest priority programs and reducing those. So
Right.
that is, and it can be either staff or operating funding.
I'll deliver this same question to your deputy minister when she returns at the conclusion of these hearings. My last question area with you relates to the WSP implementation. What can one expect from the department in terms of implementing WSP in the next, let's say, 2 years? Can you give a percentage estimate of to what extent the WSP will be in full implementation within, let's say, 2 years?
Well, I have to say that while I might speculate that's exactly what it would be, it is a priority in the work plans for those involved in salmon science, salmon fisheries management, and salmon habitat in the region. I think there is certainly an action plan having to do with the implementation of the wild salmon policy associated with Marine Stewardship Council eco-certification, which sets out that work plan. I think there will be significant movement forward, but I don't think I can put a percentage on it simply because we're dealing with the 5 stocks over the 3,500 streams that they inhabit in BC.
I appreciate that, but surely you can give this commission some sense, 2 years from now, to what extent will the WSP be implemented? I don't want to pin you down to 50%, 75%, but do you imagine within 2 years that your department will be in full implementation or partial implementation of WSP? And if it is partial, to what extent? 50%?
Well, I think, as I said, it would be speculation on my part. I think that we will have, as we have committed to do, have limit reference points, and the framework for those that was discussed in considerable detail here, I think, with the science staff and with the resource management staff in place for a far greater number of stocks than we do today. What the percentage is, I think I just simply wouldn't be confident in putting a percentage on that.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenblum. I have Mr. Eidsvik next on the list.
Good morning, Commissioner. My name is Philip Eidsvik. For the record, the Erie Gilneters Association and the BC Fisheries Survival Coalition. I wonder if Mr. Lund could be kind enough to haul up Exhibit 212, page 6 for us, please. The subject matter today is implementation of the wild salmon policy. Cultus Lake sockeye is a big concern in the management of the fishery. Is that true, Ms. Farlinger?
Certainly one of the stocks of concern in the management of the Fraser sockeye. Yeah.
And one of the wild salmon policies, and I think if I read one of the objectives is the conservation of wild salmon and their habitat is the highest priority for resource management decision making. So what would the highest priority mean to you?
It would mean in the consideration of any regulatory decisions that we make, that we have considered the conservation of the stock and those elements in the decision making and set them as a priority.
So protecting the habitat of a stock that's at risk, as Cultus Lake sockeye is, would be one of the department's very highest priorities.
That is a stated priority, protecting the habitat and conserving the stock.
So I think we look at the second paragraph there titled Eurasian milfoil, and we see Eurasian water milfoil is an invasive species. And dive surveys show that spawning areas for Cultus Lake sockeye are heavily infested. And however, the effect of water milfoil on Cultus Lake sockeye is not fully understood. So this document was published in 2005. Cultus Lake sockeye was published in 2006 when it was first recognized. I think I have those dates correct. Do I?
Well, I'd have to defer to Mr. Sprout for the exact dates, but they sound reasonable to me.
And we've known that Cultus Lake sockeye has been a problem for many decades prior to that.
Perhaps I'll
Fair to say,
defer to Mr. Sprout.
You were probably around longer.
Cultus Lake was just to clarify what you mean by that, please.
We've had a concern on Cultus Lake sockeye for many, many years long.
The status of
before.
the population.
That's right.
Yes, that's fair to say.
So here we have, perhaps you can, Mr. Sprout, you were involved, tell us how aggressive the water milfoil habitat approach is at Cultus right now and has been for the past 15 years.
Excuse me, Mr. Commissioner, this strikes me as a fairly operational kind of series of questions, and Cultus Lake is specifically on the agenda in the end of May, early June, when we're back with the habitat and integrated management parts of relating to WSP Strategy 4 and Cultus Lake and the Sarah piece are all part of that. So it may be that Mr. Sprout is not the person to answer these sorts of detailed questions, but those witnesses will be here later.
I don't need to go into it in too much detail, Mr. Commissioner. So can you tell me if there's been an aggressive active milfoil program at Cultus Lake for, say, 15 years?
I can't give you the specifics. I think there are other people that are much more knowledgeable that actually are dedicated to the Cultus Lake program, but I can say that milfoil removal or the invasion of milfoil in Cultus Lake is regarded as a habitat concern, and that the department and others have carried out removal activities over a period of time.
But you, at this point, you can't attest to the level of activities?
Presently, you mean?
No, in recent years.
I can say that the department has, Cultus Lake is one of the most studied lakes, freshwater lakes by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. The department has carried out milfoil removal, and just to explain what milfoil is, it's an invasive freshwater
Mr. Sprout,
weed.
if I could...
I'd like to respond to your question. about the habitat work the department is doing in Cultus Lake. So the department has carried out milfoil removal, contamination studies in terms of pollutants entering the lake, groundwater surveys in terms of availability of groundwater to support Fraser sockeye spawning in areas that are supported by groundwater, hydrological work looking at limnology, surface tension, surface pressure, temperature, and so forth, all of which are designed to broadly look at the issues of habitat in Cultus Lake. We actually have a laboratory in the area whose work is dedicated to that and other activities in that general area. In terms of the specific things that have been going on in the last few years, I'm not the person to talk to that. Mr. Wallace is correct. That is an operational issue that would be better referred to by the scientists and biologists who carry out the dedicated work that I referred to.
So in conclusion, you're not sure about the level of milfoil removal, even though it's a really high priority for the highest priority of the department. I can get that off another witness.
In conclusion, I would say that that operational question should be referred to an operational expert who I understand will be speaking to this later on.
And does the same go for recreation, where we talk about the millions of people and the impacts of swimming and angling on spawner migration? Has anything been done to limit the number of people on the lake? Can you tell us that?
You may want to raise that with the province,
So you can't-
because that is not a jurisdictional issue that falls into the DFO. That's a recreational fishery in freshwater, which is regulated by the province. So you may properly refer that to that agency.
If it's having an impact on habitat, such as we talk about here in your own paper, construction of piers, amount of pollution, contribution to the spread of milfoil, aren't those habitat issues?
Yes, but the question you asked me was the regulation of the fishery, and I've referred you to the agency, which is the responsible agency. Now, if the question is the fishery itself creating habitat issues?
I didn't talk about the fishery. I was referring to the building of piers, pollution, and the contributions to the spread of milfoil.
Then those habitat issues would be of interest to both the department and to the provincial agency as well as other parties.
Okay. Now, maybe perhaps you could just answer my easy question. Has the department limited the number of people, limited the pollution caused by those people on the lake in the past few years?
Actually, I spoke to this issue earlier, and I commented on the threats to Pacific salmon, Fraser sockeye in particular. And I indicated that one of the threats to Pacific salmon, Fraser sockeye in particular, is human population growth development. I've noted in the Lower Mainland in particular that human population growth, the placement of houses, bridges, and construction on a broad basis, I believe, is a very important threat to Pacific salmon. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans does not control human population growth. We don't determine how many people decide to live in a certain area and so forth. The policies the department has in relation to this particular question are specifically related to its habitat policy. The department is required to react to proposals that come forward by other agencies, regional districts, and so forth, in terms of trying to ensure that those developments that occur near water comport with our policy. But we are not, the department is not in a position to deal with the question I think you're raising, which is human population growth development. But again, once I underscore that I do believe that this is an important threat to Pacific salmon.
Well, I think one of the major parts of the wild salmon policy, and we are talking about implementation of it here, is DFO has constitutional authority to look after fisheries habitat. Is that correct? Sorry, maybe that's a question of law.
I can
I'll set
respond.
aside.
There are multiple parties that have responsibility for habitat. The province is a significant constitutional responsibility. Obviously, so is the federal government, but as well, you have to look at regional districts and other parties who have an implication or an impact on habitat. So it's a multi-jurisdictional area.
Aside from reacting to habitat issues, so that wild salmon policy becomes passed and it's implemented, doesn't in the end, where you have a person who doesn't respect habitat come down to a fishery officer going, laying charges, and bringing forth a prosecution with the assistance of the Crown?
What do you mean by not respect habitat?
Well, if somebody's going to violate the habitat provisions in the Fisheries Act, introduce a deleterious substance into the waters, or build a dam in an area where it doesn't belong and dry up some spawning bits, I'm talking about the enforcement of the habitat provisions of the wild salmon policy. In the end, doesn't it come down to a fishery officer if someone's not going to obey the law?
It's way more complicated than that. The reality is you'd have to determine what action or activity is taking place. You'd have to determine whether, in fact, that activity or action was resulting in deleterious effects on habitat, whether that triggered federal jurisdiction or provincial or other activities. And then you would have to determine whether there had been some attempt by that group or individual to comport with guidelines. In other words, I cannot give you a simple yes or no to the question you posed.
Well, if someone hasn't comported with the guidelines, I'm sorry.
Mr. Radzic, the issue of habitat enforcement, again, is a specific topic which we will cover. This line does not relate to the implementation of the wild salmon policy, in my view.
I beg to differ respectfully with Mr. Wallace, given his position and his long history of dealing with court cases and my inexperience. I'm trying to get at, if the wild salmon policy is there and we're going to implement it, does the department even today have the resources in terms of fishery officers and others to properly enforce the habitat provisions and promises in the wild salmon policy?
What the wild salmon policy commits to is in making decisions about habitat, about the regulatory decisions we have to make, that we will take into consideration information on the stock status, on the habitat issues and challenges, and the potential ecosystem impacts before making a decision. In this case, in the case of Cultus Lake Sockeye and the recovery plan for that, you'll remember that there was a proposal by COSEWIC, the Committee on Endangered. Okay, I'm not going to get that entirely right, which is why you need to talk to SARA experts. That this stock should be listed under the Species at Risk Act, and it was put to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, and the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans committed to a recovery plan which included all the elements of the wild salmon policy. So really that's the context. It's very broad and it includes all our planning, our rebuilding plans, our harvest plans, our habitat, and also the habitat regulatory work we do.
Well, it will be certainly useful because I think the Cultus Lake is given that it was listed by COSEWIC in 2002 and the wild salmon policy is now 5 years old and it's 2011, assessing the Cultus Lake situation will be useful. I guess we'll leave that for another day. I want to talk about one of the issues that was raised by you, Ms. Farlinger, about ecosystem management. And one of the implementation policies or consultant studies, and there's been many on the wild salmon policy, it talked about bears, that how the contribution of salmon to the health of bears. Now, how do you measure that in a specific year?
I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question. I think it's a fairly technical question, and I wouldn't say, as we've developed, or in the process of developing ecosystem indicators, that there's a very clear methodology for assessing the impact on bears, other than the consideration of the ecosystem impacts of allowing or not allowing or providing sufficient fish to get to the spawning grounds.
I have you about halfway through your half hour, Mr. Isaac. Mr. Commissioner, this line, again, if Mr. Isaac is going to ask further questions about a study, he needs to provide the witness with notice of that and make specific reference to it. So I'd ask that he not continue on this line.
Well, perhaps I can rephrase my question. Are bears, the health of bears, a consideration in the wild salmon policy? In your term of ecosystem management?
the contribution of salmon to the broader ecosystem in which they live and the contribution of that ecosystem to the maintenance or rebuilding of salmon populations is a consideration.
When you are implementing the wild salmon policy and you're trying to figure out what is the contribution of salmon to the health of the bears, how do you measure that? How do you measure how many salmon you need for X amount of bears?
I would just repeat my previous response to that question, which is I am not technically familiar with any studies we have on that.
I think I'll move on again, given there's no studies. Perhaps I could have Exhibit 70 of the 2002 Fraser Panel Report. And it's page 4, please. And while we're getting there, I'm going to read the objectives of the at the top of the page. And I'll read the objectives at the bottom of the first paragraph. The objectives that guide the panel's decisions the panel decision making listed in descending priority are achieve spawning escapement targets, meet international catch and allocation goals, and meet domestic catch allocation objectives. Conservation concerns of the parties for other species and stocks are addressed throughout the process. Those to me are very clear objectives. Can you show me in the 57-page wild salmon policy where there's such clear measurable objectives that you can measure every year? And that's what I was raising with the bears. I had a problem trying to measure how many salmon we need to put on the grounds for bears. Very clearly here we have objectives for the Fraser Panel.
I think the wild salmon policy is a domestic policy, and it falls within the domestic activities. The Pacific Salmon Treaty, which is an agreement between the U.S. and Canada, is very much focused on considering those conservation objectives that each country has within its own domestic programs, and fundamentally is focused on these objectives that are set out here.
And for many of us, measuring failure and success at the end of the year is a pretty good thing so far as implementation goes. And I see in the Fraser Panel, it's pretty easy. Did you achieve the spawning escapement targets? Did you meet international catch allocations? And in the wild salmon policy, in the 57 pages, plus many additional reports, I have a hard time trying to figure out what objective are you trying to measure and how do you measure it. Maybe you can help me there. Because frankly, at the end of salmon policy and the other papers, I'm confused.
I think the objectives of the wild salmon policy are fairly clearly stated in terms of maintaining the diversity of wild salmon and the conservation objectives of the policy, and we could certainly go back to those if necessary. I think the wild salmon policy is a far-reaching document that sets out a number of objectives and the processes for reaching those objectives. The context of measuring the success of the Fraser River Panel is somewhat more constrained and somewhat easier to measure than broad concepts like conservation and biodiversity. But certainly in terms of stocks with limit reference points, how those limit reference points are incorporated into management in those stocks that's one example of many of progress in terms of implementing the wild salmon policy, and Mr. Sprout may have some more examples.
I do. Well, first of all, you realize that you're comparing two different things. The Fraser River Panel hierarchy that you've referred to is principally an allocation hierarchy. What it says is, number one, the first objective is conservation, and then what's left for available harvest then has to be distributed internationally and then domestically. So you need to look at it in that context. So if you go back to number one, what's guiding number one? What's guiding the conservation objective? Well, domestically, from DFO's perspective, it will now be the wild salmon policy. The wild salmon policy will be informing number one. Then as you determine the allowable harvest, you will be allocating it. You'll have international arrangements, And in Canada, you'll have domestic arrangements between First Nations, recreational, commercial. And that's the way you need to look at this exhibit. Now, when you come to the wild salmon policy, the question is are there objectives? Well, there is. I mean, look at the policy on page 8. There's a little house. And the little house at the top has a goal. Then it has objectives. Then it has strategies. There are 6 strategies. Under the 6 strategies, there's 17 actions. So the strategies are bound to be realized by implementing these actions. Then there are a set of principles. In fact, one of the, I think, arguments about the wild salmon policy was the clarity about what it is the department was trying to accomplish. In fact, one of the criticisms that we received in earlier RDG panels is you haven't done enough to actually implement what you said you would do. So in fact, I think there is a lot of clarity about what we would do. The debate is about how well we have done it. Anyway, I have a slightly different perspective than council on that. But nevertheless, I did want to respond more broadly to this question.
I appreciated your response, and I think the fact that there's a number of strategies and objectives helps me get to my conclusion. If I could go to this exhibit, please.
What number is that? 75? Thank you.
And we're going to go to page 310, please. And the section I'm looking at is non-political control. And it's that paragraph there. The commission from 1937 to the early 1970s focused on the needs of the resource. Additional problems also arose during these years. However, the commission enjoyed a free rein to pursue these without undue interference from governments or the fishing industry. While the commission was not always impervious to political forces, those forces were mostly supportive. Actions or statements by political entities outside the commission did not deter the commission from achieving its goals and continuing its commitment to the convention. And I probably should start off, Mr. Sproat, with the rebuilding of Fraser River Sockeye from 37 to the early 1990s, specifically the 60s to the early 1990s. Would you agree that that was a pretty magnificent job of rebuilding Fraser Sockeye?
I would.
And under the wild salmon policy, do you think that there's enough clear objectives there that we can repeat that process?
Except for 2 big problems. One is climate change. There is something happening in the ocean that is affecting the survival of Pacific salmon, particularly southern stocks, more specifically Fraser Sockeye. This phenomena is likely to persist, and it is dramatically affecting the returns of Fraser Sockeye. This is not control that the agency has, or any one agency. The second threat, in my opinion, that contrasts with this period of time that you selected is human population growth development. The reality is human beings like to come and live in the Lower Mainland. They like to come and live in the Shuswap system. They like to live in areas that are close to salmon, and they like to use water for human consumption, for agricultural development, for industrial use. And these are things that we're going to have to come to grips with in order to address the issue of future sustainability of salmon, and specifically Fraser Sockeye.
You'd be surprised that council would agree with you certainly on the habitat issue, Mr. Sproat. The next page I'd like to refer to is page 302 in the same exhibit. And it's the last paragraph on the page. Mr. Sproat, while we're getting there, you'd agree, though, that habitat is under the full authority of the Department of Fisheries to take steps to protect habitat?
No, I would not. You have to explain in more detail what you mean by that. If you mean the deposit of deleterious substances, the disruption of habitat under certain circumstances that are not authorized, then we have a role. but so is the Department of Environment, so is the provincial government, and so do regional districts. So you have to be a bit more precise by what you mean by that.
I think when we get to the habitat section of this, we can investigate this further. In the last paragraph, the last sentence in the rebuilding, restoring phase of River Sockeye, and this is why I'm conflicted by the wild salmon policy. The Commission's ability to get the job done was primarily related to the simplicity of its mandate and the efficient manner in which it was permitted to implement the decision-making process. Now, in the wild salmon policy, we have the 57-page document. We have a number of other studies and reports how to implement those 57 pages. And do you agree with me that the complexity of interpreting and applying and the other issues created by these very voluminous documents in the wild salmon policy and the associated documents is a detriment rather than assistant to the preservation and enhancement of Fraser Sockeye?
I agree that complexity is a problem, but I disagree on the source. You're arguing that the wild salmon policy is the source of the complexity. I think that's completely misreading the situation. The reality is, since this document is published, we've had the Sparrow decision. First Nations have undetermined rights and title. We have to figure out how to deal with that issue. Climate change has come along and has been recognized since this document was published. Human population growth is expanding in the areas that I've talked about. Water withdrawal is occurring. Invasive species are occurring in watersheds that were not present when this document took place. Therefore, you need to look at these as the sources of the complexity and the policies as the tools to try to manage them as best we can. I mean, I think all of us would wish sometimes we could go back to where we were. But the reality is things have changed and we have to adjust to them as best we can.
So if I can sum up your testimony then at the end of my conclusion here, we have no control over global warming as a society, or limited as you as a regulator, but you do have authority over habitat, you do have authority over fishing.
In terms of the main threats to Pacific salmon, the department cannot deal with human population growth development. We do not determine how many people decide to live or not in a certain watershed. I'm arguing that this needs to be looked at carefully if you're going to get at the issue of sustainability. The things that the department can control are things that are consistent with its regulation and legislation and its policies. So we have involvement in habitat in those areas where our regulations specifically apply. When it comes to fisheries, particularly fisheries authorized by the federal government, we have a great deal of control in terms of issuance of licenses and the control of the fisheries itself. In other areas, the jurisdiction is much more shared.
Thank you, witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
I have, it's now 11:15, Mr. Commissioner. We have Mr. Harvey, Mr. Lowe's, and Ms. Gertner remaining. Would this be a convenient time to break?
I think Mr. Lowe's was going to be shorter, is that?
Yes, perhaps.
Is it convenient to get that in and then take the break? Would that work? Mr. Lowe's, if that doesn't work, just say so.
Kay Lowe's for the BC Wildlife Federation and the BC Federation of Drift Fishers. First to Ms. Farlinger. I assume, Ms. Farlinger, that you in particular and the department are monitoring carefully these proceedings?
Yes.
And in particular, you've heard the evidence of Dr. Walters and Dr. Woody on the question of overescapement?
I know of it, but I don't know of it in detail.
If I told you that during the course of that evidence, some challenges were made to fundamental assumptions of the underlying the wild salmon policy, would that be a matter of concern?
Would certainly be a matter of interest, yes.
Yes. And if I was to tell you that the thrust of the evidence, at least in part, was that in some cases, harvesting or not harvesting the bigger runs caused problems to the bigger runs, that in cases out of proportion to the benefits to the smaller runs. Would that be of concern?
I think, as I've said, there is a variety. There are a variety of views in the scientific community on this, and we would certainly consider any of those views, including those of Dr. Walters.
Yeah. Are you going to consider them?
Yes.
How?
Yes.
How? And when?
I don't know the exact answer to that question, but I do know as we go through each year in terms of the annual planning for fisheries that we evaluate the frameworks we use for decision making. We take into account information and evidence. We have had, for example, the salmon workshop that was carried out under the under the Pacific Salmon Commission last year. We use fora like that to bring scientists together to arrive at a consensus on what we know and what we don't know. So there's a variety of ways that we take that into account. Scientific reports prepared by external scientists are routinely considered in our science peer review process.
Yeah. Are you aware of Dr. Walters' suggestion that over the last decade or so, some 25 million sockeye could have been harvested that were not?
Mr. Commissioner, I reluctantly am going to object to this line of questions. It has very little to do with the wild salmon policy. We heard a lot from Dr. Walters. If we're going to start now embarking upon Dr. Walters' evidence with this panel, we really open up the door for other participants to come and ask these questions as well. I would suggest that this is totally not within the mandate of this panel's participation, particularly with respect to the wild salmon policy.
Well, my next question, Mr. Commissioner, was whether if the witness had heard such a suggestion, it had any influence on the implementation of the wild salmon policy.
There are, as you know, many suggestions out there, and what we do in the course of implementing the wild salmon policy and making our regulatory decisions is review new science and incorporate it, given the uncertainty around it, into management actions and therefore the implementation of the wild salmon policy. This is one of many views and studies that are put forward by science experts that we need to consider in terms of the long-term implementation of the policy, as well as regular annual decisions we make on fisheries management.
Well, with respect, Ms. Farlinger, I suggest this is a very serious suggestion by a very eminent scientist, and that the department ought to take it seriously right now.
May I speak to this point, please, in terms of process?
Mr. Commissioner, I agree with Mr. Leadham's objection. This is going well down a path which has been well trodden, and I think it would be leading ourselves into repetition of arguments under the guise of relating them to the wild salmon policy.
Perhaps you can move on.
Yes. Is strategy 4 in the wild salmon policy, is that a decision-making process, or is that a process to design a decision-making process? Do you understand the distinction?
Well, I hope that I do. I think that strategy 4 is intended to provide those who are interested in and impacted by potential decisions that come out of the implementation of the wild salmon policy to work together, to collaborate, and to provide recommendations to the minister.
I asked a question yesterday of a recreational panel, and I'm going to ask the same question to you in a little different way. If Mr. Wallace thinks it should be dealt with at another time, I'm happy to deal with that, but I would like the question on the record. And the question is this. In summary terms, how, by whom, and when are broad policies and concepts by whom and how do they become articulated in specific management decisions? And I'm thinking, when I talk about decisions, I mean fishing plans, firstly, and in-season decisions. And I ask that question with respect to the model provided by the WSP, the model that you are presently working under, pending the WSP, and in case and the actual situation as it is, whether it's consistent with your model or not. I think just to put that in context, it's kind of formalizing, Mr. Sprout, your answer to some of Mr. Eidsvik's questions about the policies of the WSP and how they get implemented. But I would like to deal with that not just in futuro, as in accordance with the WSP, but in the model that you're following now.
The question seems to me a broad one, and I'll see if I have got it right, which is how do we translate departmental ministerial policy into operations and regulatory decisions?
It's more the who is the we and how is it done, yes.
First of all, in terms of a policy as broad as the wild salmon policy, and in fact most policies, they are approved by the minister. So there is a process we go through which, depending on the policy and people who are influenced or interested in that policy, where there is a consultation, where there is analyses, and where the results of those are provided to the minister for a decision. In terms of implementation, I think the most specific thing I can refer to here is step by step as we go through the integrated, on the other end, the integrated fishery management planning process, where the science and the decisions associated with that science are available. These things are then incorporated into the consultations on the integrated fishery management plan. And I'll turn to my colleague.
Well, I wanted to go one level below that. Now you've got the plan, and the staff managers have the plan. Let's say it's the recreational fishery. How does that plan and the policies and the priorities that are set out in the plan get brought down to a specific management decision in a specific situation? Who decides, for example, what a Aboriginal priority is, or what the requirements of conservation are in the specific management situation?
These are the subject of consultation are embodied in the integrated fishery management plan. Elements of the integrated fishery management plan that have broad policy implications are dealt with through briefing and policy advice to the minister, who then will approve decisions at that level that can affect the integrated fishery management plan. Along the way, the minister will ultimately, in the case of salmon, approve the integrated fishery management plan, which sets out a set of decision rules about how decisions will be made in the fishery, including what are the escapement requirements, how will decisions be made when run sizes change in season, and a variety. In fact, I think you've heard about them over the last couple of weeks, the myriad of decisions, operational decisions that will be taken inside the fishery.
Well, that's not quite responsive to my question. And yesterday we had a witness who was a staff manager in the recreational fishery, and one of the kinds of decisions that that manager would have to make, perhaps during the course of a season or even before a season, was with respect to a particular, with respect to the sockeye fishery. Let's say in a certain situation the Aboriginal priority would be respected. What is the input that is given to that manager, and what is and how is that input in terms of policy articulated in terms of the answer to the question that is asked of that manager?
I'm doing my best to understand your question. I think when a decision is made in season about priority and opening and closing of fisheries, that decision is supported. The fishery manager does not make it on their own. They're supported by the salmon coordinator, they're supported by science staff, and then ultimately decisions are made by managers, and if necessary, the minister is consulted and requested to make the decision. Okay, sometimes those decisions are made at the regional level, sometimes they're made at the national level.
I won't push it. One more question then before I sit. You, in answer to Mr. Eidsvik's, one of Mr. Eidsvik's question, I think Ms. Farland, it was about the consistency or lack of consistency, or no, this was, sorry, Mr. Rosenblum's question, the consistency or inconsistency of the wild salmon policy with the potential problems caused by over-escapement. And I think you indicated in the course of your argument that potential problems of over-escapement would be taken into account in the decisions made after implementation of the wild salmon policy. Am I correct, though, that the decision whether or not to override a lower limit decision to protect a small stock is the minister's decision? Under the AFS, it's the minister's decision to decide whether or not to put a small stock at risk.
Do you mean under the WSP? You said
Yeah,
AFS.
under the WSP.
The ones that I am familiar with, cultists being the most obvious, that was a ministerial decision. So the minister made the decision ultimately about what would be the exploitation rate on cultists, which is regarded as a stock that's at risk. So that, in that particular case, you are correct. I would envision in the future that those kinds of stocks at risk where there's argument for fishing even more greatly on those stocks, my expectation would be the minister would continue to have a significant role, a deciding role in those situations.
Yes, thank you.
Commissioner, is this a convenient time to break?
Hearing will now recess for 15 minutes.